Greetings, everyone. This is Josh with Horror Hangouts, and today my guest is the writer and author of the book Frightful Fables, which is a collection of 12 scary tales, and his name is DC Phillips. How are you doing, DC?
Hey, thanks for having me, Josh. It's been a while, and I'm glad to be on the show today.
Yeah, for those who don't know, a few months ago when I was at the Days of the Dead convention, HorrorCon in Las Vegas, besides meeting certain celebrities, my next favorite thing to do is to talk to some of the vendors, and that's how I stumbled upon DC and his book and his little stand there, and it's always great talking to other authors. So finally,
Yeah.
hence why he's a guest today's show. So one question is, what got you started in writing in the first place?
That is a great question. It's something that I've just always loved doing. Even when I was a little kid, I liked telling stories, drawing pictures and making up some kind of narrative to go along with it. And I've always loved words, communication. It's always just been I was never that math kid. I was more language arts and really enjoyed getting into those assignments. So since I was really young, I remember just really enjoying writing. I had a second grade teacher, Miss Duncan, if I can find her and maybe show her this someday. She was really the one person who said, I think you really need to keep up with this. She was like the first person who told me that. And a lot of us who are writers have those memories of a teacher or family member who give you a little push and say, keep this up. So yeah, always loved it in regard to Frightful Fables in particular, this has been really a passion project, 10 years in the making, 10 plus, honestly. Um, 10 years ago, I put out a condensed version. If any music lovers are out there, if you think of the EP versus the LP, right? I put out sort of a sampler 10 years ago that was ebook only and short and sweet. And I was able to expand that collection into what it is now, 13 Tales of Terror. And so, yeah, just always been a hobby.
Yeah, I was going to ask what led you to write this because it's not just like, like I said, you have like several different stories, kind of like an anthology series. Why did you want to go that route with it rather than writing one big story like a novella or a novel? What prompted you to want to do separate stories and put them into one?
I've always loved this format, the medium of short stories. Just some of my favorite authors. I know one in particular who people may think, well, that's not a horror author, but Flannery O'Connor has
Hmm.
always been a huge influence, Southern Gothic, weird characters. And I just love that short stories can be such a slice of life. It gets you thinking, it gets you to use your imagination, and then there's I enjoy a cliffhanger. I know some people can't stand cliffhangers, but short stories just lend themselves to that. And also just thinking back to the inspiration for Frightful Fables in particular, you've got your Tales from the Crypt, your Twilight Zone, your Tales from the Dark Side. So I've always been drawn to that format and just really enjoyed it. Had fun um, writing short stories in particular.
Very good. So, um, how do you prepare when you decide, all right, this is the story I want to write? Is there a certain process you go through as far as preparing to write? Um, do you write down some ideas, just brainstorm, or how does that process work for you?
You know, the process varies. I'm sure same for you as a fellow author. Sometimes you have an idea for one scene, especially
Hmm.
in horror. You're like, oh man, that would be a really cool death scene or something like that.
Right.
And the rest kind of falls into place. And other times you have a really fleshed out narrative that you kind of start pulling at those threads of that initial idea and it all comes together. I will say, I know in the writing community at large, there's talk of pantsers who just kind of fly by the seat of their pants. And I would say I'm sometimes that's me, but usually I at least have fragments that I think, okay, these could all work together. Let me see how I can connect them
Hmm.
and bring this together in a coherent story.
Very good. So, is there any? Oh, what was I going to say? So, how do you approach, like, obviously important part of having a story is characters. So, is there a
Mhm.
particular process you go through or technique you use in writing your characters? Are they inspired by maybe someone you know, or how do you like create your characters and have them grow?
Some of them are inspired by real people. They may be inspired by figures from true crime stories or, unsolved mysteries that I hear about, read about, see in a documentary and think, wow, I wonder if I could take this and develop it, maybe tell the story of what happened, right?
Hmm.
And I will say characterization for me in particular, going back to Flannery O'Connor, I really love flawed characters.
Hmm.
So regardless of whether this is inspired by somebody I know, or maybe even I pick elements of personalities I've interacted with, or even bits and pieces of my own personality, I really like to tap into that dark side, even of the protagonist,
Hmm.
because I sometimes there's a fine line, because if a protagonist is totally unlikable, then the audience doesn't connect with them at all,
Right.
right? Or if they keep making stupid decisions, like in so many of our beloved cult classic movies and
Hmm.
horror franchises, running up the stairs when they could have gone out a window, that sort of thing. There's a fine balance, but I think when characters are flawed, they're a little bit more relatable if we're honest with ourselves,
Hmm.
right?
Right. Oh yeah, because I think within like your protagonists, any good protagonist is someone that we can connect to or relate to on some level. Because if we can't, then we don't care when they're in danger or whatnot. It's like
Right.
it's kind of like my I'm a Batman person versus Superman because Superman seems flawless. He's perfect, whereas Batman has this dark side to him and he had to go through some real shit,
Yeah.
basically. I mean, so it kind of goes along with that.
Yep, I agree. That's me 100%.
So you mentioned Flannery is obviously one of your favorite authors. Who are some of your other favorite authors that you just like their work or maybe have influenced you in some form or fashion?
Yeah, I would say right now, there are several authors who are must reads for me. Anytime I see that something out is from them and new, Riley Sager is one. I love his thrillers, especially a lot of them may start out with what feels like a familiar formula, like House Across the Lake. It had a very Rear Window type of feel, and no spoilers, but you get about halfway through or so and it's like the bottom falls out and you
Hmm.
think, okay, this is going in a totally different direction. So that's one. I would say also Ruth Ware is another.
Hmm.
I love that her books, a couple of them that I've read, are sort of inspired by very famous works in the genre.
Uh-huh.
One of hers is kind of follows a modern take on Turn of the Screw by
Uh-huh.
Henry James. And one I'm reading right now is following sort of an Agatha Christie plot line, from And Then There Were None, but with very modern take. And so I love anything they do. They can do no wrong. Um, I would say in addition to the classics, I mean, we all name Stephen King, right?
Hmm.
We all name Shirley Jackson, Robert Bloch. I would say one for me who I feel doesn't always get enough credit is John Saul.
Okay.
Um, I love his books. He came out around the same time as your Stephen Kings and your Dean
Hmm.
Koontz, but I just don't feel like he gets his credit. Um, and a personal note on him, years and years and years and years ago, he was the first author before social media that I decided I was going to send an email to.
Okay.
And I waited and I waited and I'm like, "Oh, okay, he's too busy." And at that
Hmm.
point, he was already, I think, getting into retirement. Um, but he responded one day out of nowhere, months later. An email pops up and he said, "Hey, I'm sorry, I don't check this account very often. I'm living my life in Hawaii." But he said, it may sound simple, but write something every day,
Hmm.
because even if you're not feeling it now and it doesn't go anywhere, you could pick it back up a year from now and say, "Hey, this
Hmm.
was actually pretty good," or maybe you pick it up and run with it. So he's one who always, I just see him as such a nice guy, and his books, you'll always find them at the used bookstores in the horror
Uh-huh.
section. So if anybody out there has not read any John Saul, please, please, please check him out.
Yeah, I'm writing his name down now because I've actually this is the first time I've heard of him, so so I'll have to check
Yeah,
out some of his stuff then.
for
Um,
sure.
oh yeah. What are some of your, well, you mentioned your authors. Do you have a particular one or two or three favorite books that you just, just your very favorites?
I would say anything that leans Gothic, Southern Gothic in particular, is going to be a hit with me and is probably at the top of my all-time list. Um, Especially for people just getting into the genre, I would say my favorite Stephen King is Salem's Lot.
Hmm.
That one is just top tier for me. Shirley Jackson, The Haunting of Hill House,
Right.
and again, a lot of times I tend to read more gothic mystery thriller, and that's sort of the lane that I stay in as a writer. So even Daphne du Maurier,
Hmm.
Rebecca, she's one who's always at the top of my list. I always recommend. Um, those three are really top tier for me. Can do no wrong.
That's interesting. You mentioned those topics because I'm going to have an author on next month who's into Southern Gothic type
Oh,
of stuff, and I
cool.
have I have two that are next week that's more into old folklore type of Gothic types of horror. So that's interesting. You mentioned those.
Nice,
Um,
nice. I like
oh
it.
yeah, yeah, and I'm one that I like to. I've already found as an author that I'm going to probably be hitting several different subgenres of it. It's just whatever I kind of felt like. My first one was Western horror, and now I'm finishing up on a vampire,
Yeah,
Gothic vampire fiction.
yeah.
So,
And that's
and who
that's
knows
one
what I
thing.
do on the next one.
Yeah, of course. And that's what I love. I think some of are, the best horror authors who've had decades long careers and adaptations, like a Richard Matheson, like a
Hmm.
Robert Bloch. There's variety out there with Richard Matheson. Even his Twilight Zone episodes or movie scripts, like for Duel.
Hmm.
Things are so vastly different, but they all work and they all hit those themes that we as readers and fans of that one author still will read and enjoy. So it's nice to have that variety there.
Well, that's something I like about like going from books to films. Something I like about John Carpenter, he's done a little bit of everything. He's done the slasher with Halloween. He's done the classic ghost story with The Fog. He's done
Mhm.
sci-fi horror with The Thing and They Live, which is probably leans more sci-fi than horror. So he's done like then he does like demonic, I guess you could call Prince of Darkness kind of like devil horror, perhaps. So he's like,
Yeah,
and he's done the vampire horror with vampires. So he's done a little bit of everything. That's something why I kind of like his work. He's never done something the same
mm-mm.
twice, it seems like.
But it's all good. We all
Yeah.
keep coming back to it. And he has that kind of legacy where now I feel like he really picks projects that he wants to do.
Hmm.
He's got his feet up. He's like, I've done enough, guys. I'll do the music for this new movie, or I'll produce over here. But he has such a legacy that he can just kind of pick and choose what he'd like to do now, which is awesome.
Yeah, I think with him, he's more content on just making music and playing. From what I hear, playing video games is what his
Yeah.
big thing is now. I think his last movie, I think he kind of soured him on directing. The Ward, I don't think was a that's even, and that I'll admit was not his better film. But I hear there's a lot
Yeah.
of studio stuff going on there. Which it's a great thing about writing is we can just write what we want, and outside of having an editor or whatnot we don't have, at least I don't run into it yet anyway, probably because I'm independent like yourself. a committee telling me I need to do this or that differently or whatever.
Exactly. And for a John Carpenter, it's just funny because even when he has what we would call a flop, or the
Hmm.
public would deem a flop, it's still 10 times better than anything, some others might put out. I mean, he's just
Well, it's like The Thing was a flop when it came out, and now it's considered one of the greatest horror movies ever. So it's
yeah,
like,
you never
and he
know.
had,
Give it time.
yep, in 20 years, you never know. So, since we're on the subject of horror, where did your love of horror begin?
I I have to say probably anybody watching this has a similar story of remembering your first tape you rented from Blockbuster or movies that came on TV and you just sat there hooked.
Hmm.
I've always loved dark things, and I think even as a child, I wore out a VHS set tape or maybe two of The Wizard of Oz, and
Hmm.
I was obsessed with the witch. Anytime the Wicked Witch came out, I was just hooked.
Right.
um, and I remember at such a young age trick or treating. This is just a really fun memory I'm sure people can relate to. But I remember getting home, I would be in my little Batman costume with didn't even bother to take the cowl or the cape off and just dump candy out on the floor and zone out to AMC's Monster Fest
Oh
or
yeah.
what was on TCM. And I remember as a kid just loving those Vincent Price movies, uh, The Haunting. I even bugged and bugged and bugged my mom to rent Night of the Living Dead. I was probably 6 years old, and finally she said, "You know what? I'm going to teach you a lesson. Go grab it." And I think I maybe made it 15 minutes into the movie
Yeah.
at that time. But, I kept coming back for more and more and more and was totally hooked.
Oh yeah, I think that all started with all of us. I worked my way up. I started with the old Universal monster movies and just gradually worked my way up through the decades. And I think it was like one Halloween night in '87. I want to say I'm giving up my age. I was 13 at the time. Come back home from trick or treating, which was probably I think the last year I actually did that. And I want to say I think it was WGN television, which used to be on cable. I guess it still is, but from Chicago, and they had Halloween and Halloween 2 back to back, and that was
Mhm.
like my intro to kind of like the modern slasher, and it exploded even more after that.
Yeah, and that's the funny thing because for so many of us, and at these conventions, that's what I
Mm,
love is meeting people with who are like-minded, who have those interests and those memories. Because for all of us, horror was
mhm,
always there. It's
mhm,
always been part of family time or bonding with friends, pop in a scary movie at a sleepover. Um, and it's just always been that way for me. But Southern Gothic for me also
mhm,
carries over into movies because for some reason as a kid, I guess we were just watching. I'm an only child, so I
mhm.
think sometimes my parents would be watching something and maybe didn't realize I was paying attention in the background. But I always loved one of my favorite movies of all time is Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte with Betty Davis.
God, I remember seeing that. I remember my mom watching that, and she let me watch it. And I don't know how old I was at the time. Maybe couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. For
Yeah, it's
sure. And that's
and I mean
interesting
it's
you brought that up, and because I haven't seen it since then, but I remember it being a really pretty good movie, really.
Yeah, and I think it was, I mean, fun fact, I don't know, somebody can check me on this, but I think it was one of the first movies to depict dismemberment. So,
It's something we'll have to look up because, yeah, it was a little bit ahead of its time, I think, at the time.
yeah.
That movie, and I don't know if everyone remembers the old show Bewitched. I remember that the lady who played like the cranky old grandmother witch or whatever, um, I don't remember her name, but she was in it. I just remember her being in that movie. I'm like, really? I just saw her on Bewitched.
But yeah,
But that
I
might
mean,
have been one of Betty Davis's best performances, and it was later in life for her, I think.
yeah, definitely. And another life lesson in there, right? Keep going.
Hmm.
You might start to get typecast because she did kind of start to get
Hmm.
typecast as sort of the crazy old lady, but it worked for her at the same time.
Well, the good thing about horror is, unfortunately, the way the film industry works, and this hits, unfortunately, the actresses more than the actors, because it seems like once you hit a certain age, you stop
Hmm.
getting roles.
Yeah,
Fortunately, in horror, seems to be that one genre where someone like Dee Wallace can continue to do movies if she wants to, and
yeah.
in all those, and why not? They should. I mean, it's kind of. I always thought it's kind of weird when you watch a mainstream movie and I'm seeing Al Pacino and his girlfriend is like 40 years younger than him, and I'm like, come on.
Right, or they cast somebody to play the mom of a teenage character, and the mom is in her early 30s, and it's like, "Wait a minute, what? This isn't right." But you're right there. I think
Yeah.
Jamie Lee Curtis is a great example. I think she
Hmm.
had kind of hit a little, crossroads, if you will, in her career of where do I go from here, and
Hmm.
rebooting the Halloween movies. Say what you will about the new ones, because
Right.
I have my opinions as well.
Yeah, me
Um,
too.
but,
But
she's back on the scene, full she's one of the hottest stars out there right now, her career-wise, so
oh yeah, and we could go on and on, but on that. And speaking of conventions, what how long have you been, you of course have been attending conventions as a vendor, where you can
mhm.
sell your books at. How long have you been doing that?
So, I've been spectating for several years now and started to meet some of the vendors and
Hmm.
connect with them on social media and think, maybe I should give this a try." So my first major one was actually last year at Atlanta Comic Con,
Hmm.
and from there, I was hooked. For anybody looking into being a vendor, I think it's all about really finding your lane
Hmm.
because not every convention is successful for everyone.
Right.
I've had to kind of navigate because there have been some uh for me, where there is, I've learned this just to share for anyone else who may be considering jumping in, if you
Hmm.
need some indie tips. But
Right.
the Comic Cons and things like that, people are definitely there for superheroes and anime,
Right.
and that's great. And for me, haven't been as have been great for networking and
Hmm.
learning and just
Right.
fun.
Hmm.
But I've really been loving some of the smaller, more niche local markets and
Hmm.
things like that. I've noticed the heavy metal community is very welcoming for horror,
Well, I'm
anything
sure.
horror
Hmm.
related. And I just went to one called Blackstrap Music Hall. They had a music festival here in Georgia, where I live. I'm
Uh-huh.
in the Atlanta area,
Right.
and yeah, markets like that. It's just everybody is so welcoming, open arms,
Oh
100%
yeah.
across the board.
That's interesting because about a month or so ago, I had a guest on, Stacy Lane Wilson, who's a filmmaker. She's also a rock and roll historian. She loves horror, does it all. And we were talking about how interesting it is that hard rock and metal fans overlap a lot into the horror community. And that's a great example of another,
Yeah,
um, of horror and metal
for
combining.
sure. For sure. And Days of the Dead, where we met in Vegas, I actually went there because one of my best friends, who also happened to edit Frightful Fables, because she is an editor professionally. And if you
I
need,
think I met her there too. Yeah.
yeah, anybody out there, indie authors, especially if you're looking for editing service, check her out, Anna Dunn. You can find her through my social media, but she's getting into editing more books, short stories, things like that, and loves horror also. So that's how I ended up in Vegas visiting my friend.
Hmm.
And it's great networking, a great time. And it's been a lot of fun for me to go to these different events on both sides of the table.
Oh yeah, and have you like obviously I know there's a Days of the Dead. In fact, I think they have two of them here in Atlanta. Have you gone there yet as a vendor yet? So that's
I
obviously.
haven't. I
Oh
have
really?
not. That's actually my first convention that I started going to as a
Hmm.
fan.
Hmm.
And I had just missed the cutoff. Frightful Fables came out, this year in February, and
Hmm.
I had just missed the tables were all full, and I was like kicking myself. So that's how I ended up in Vegas,
Right.
far away from home. But yeah, I'm gonna check out the Atlanta dates for sure here.
Yeah, and it's something I've thought about doing, especially when I get my second book out. It's just a matter of, well, because I know the chances of making one's money back from what you pay those things is probably slim to none. So you have to treat it more like a vacation and as a opportunity to network. So I'm like just gathering ones that are at least within driving range of where I live now, and
Yeah,
thinking about doing that as well. Is it kind of cool because you mentioned, Night of the Living Dead being one of the first ones that you movies you'd watched, and of course, at the Days of the Dead there in Vegas, there was many of the cast members
yeah,
from that movie. Did that like put you in awe a little bit to see those people that
yeah.
once scared the hell out of you all those
It
years
did.
ago?
And I mean, we were facing each other. That was
Hmm.
what was so crazy because the booths are just assigned, right? When you pick
Hmm.
one. And so I didn't know who I would be across from. Some conventions will send a map in advance, and others are kind of like,
Right.
just come on, get in here. We'll show you where to go. So when I got in early, because vendor setup was kind of before,
Right.
the hustle and bustle got started. So
Hmm.
I saw the name tags of all of the people who were across from me. And when
Uh-huh.
I saw the cast of the Night of the Living Dead and Mr. Kassir, the crypt keeper,
Right.
I almost needed to just take a break. I didn't even know what to say. Um, but eventually, kind of one by one, when I noticed that their tables, there was kind of a lull, maybe people were having
Hmm.
lunch. I kind of went over and introduced myself and, hey, I'm kind of a big fan. I'm your neighbor as well. Um, and that was truly an incredible experience as a horror fan. Definitely.
Yeah, I can imagine too. And it's weird. I liked how, I don't know if it was any better or not. The only other horror con I'd been to prior to that was one I went to in Denver about a year ago. And the way that one was set up is you had one room where all the celebrities was and one room where all the vendors were. Now, the
Yeah.
one here in Vegas, they had to where, for the most part, all the celebrities were by and large around the perimeter of
Mhm.
the room. I mean, some were in the inside as well too, because I know a lot of the Aliens cast members were, but most of them
Yeah.
were on the perimeter, while the vendors were like in the in in the inside of that
Mhm.
whole circle. So that was an interesting way of setting that up, and I suppose that was better for you because you could still kind
Yes.
of see the celebrities as well as
Yeah, and that's
trying
the
to sell the
thing
book.
that exactly. I mean, when they kind of separate things, I get it because I'm sure there
Hmm.
are people who fan out and maybe cause a scene. I don't know. That's why I try to be very hey, how are you? Don't want to bother
Right.
you or don't want to take sales away from, crowd your
Exactly.
table because I know
Yeah.
everybody's there to meet them, right? Not
Hmm.
necessarily me. Uh
Right.
you'll meet me in the process, but
Right.
I'm not Greg
The
Nicotero who
main
lives
event.
around the corner.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Or anybody else who is their celebrity. But yeah, when they keep things separate, it's kind of hard because you need to stay at your table and
Hmm.
talk about your book and meet people,
Right.
but you want to go mix and mingle and meet the celebrities too. So, like you said, it was just that for me was made my whole experience. It was awesome.
During my brief experience, what I have learned so far about these cons is a I like to do I like to set aside Friday and Sunday, particularly Friday, to meet the celebrities and Saturdays to meet the vendors because Fridays and Sundays normally not as packed. So you can spend a little bit more time talking to the
Yep.
celebrities. And then while it is busy, then you can go around and meet the vendors. And I noticed one thing
Yep.
before my wife and I left that Sunday morning, we decided to do one walk around, I think, the through the convention space. And it was kind of cool because I know some of the celebrities were going around talking to some of the vendors and all that. So I thought it was pretty nice of them. They're going up and introducing themselves to the vendors as well, which was pretty neat to see.
Yeah, and that happened to me too. There was the big standout for me. You mentioned D Wallace, which is funny.
Mhm.
There was after a couple of days, I kind of lost the nervousness, you kind of shake it off, because
Yeah.
you're like, okay, we're all in here, we're all in the coffee break room.
Right.
But it was funny because I saw Greg Nicotero walk by,
Mm-hmm.
and I just came out. I said, Mr. Nicotero. And he turned around and came over, and we had the coolest conversation. Such a nice guy. And then as we're talking, D Wallace comes by and starts talking to Greg Nicotero. And I'm like, this is just insane. The mom from Cujo and E.T. and the star of The Howling, so many fantastic
Yeah.
movies. And Greg Nicotero, who I think is the only person to have worked with all of the major slasher franchises, I want to say. I mean,
Yeah.
he's done makeup for all of them pretty much. Um, it, we're just having a chat. It's such a surreal experience, and if anybody has the chance to go, if anybody's on the fence about vending like at a Days of the Dead or things like that,
Mm-hmm.
do it because you're gonna have a great time.
Yeah, yeah. Whether it's vending or just going as a fan, you should certainly
Exactly.
go. I remember, and by and large, if you feel like you're going to be nervous meeting any of these celebrities, don't be. There's only one celebrity ever that was somewhat nervous meeting, and that's only because I've had like a teenage crush on her. But once you start talking to them, they say hello. It's almost like you're talking to your next door neighbor in
Oh
some
yeah,
form of fashion. They just happen to be doing something that's fairly unique and extraordinary versus,
yeah.
our normal nine to
I
five
mean,
jobs.
right. And years, I think it may have been the first Days of the Dead I went to in Atlanta years ago. After a friend of mine and I, actually Anna, who I mentioned, who edited this
Hmm.
book, she and I went out after the convention to a local bar, and Tony Todd, the Candyman, was there. And nicest, again, another super nice guy. And I guess the only downside, if you want to call it that, is the next time I watched a Candyman movie, I was
Hmm.
like, oh, Mr. Todd. I kind of I wasn't that terrified. I was like, oh, he was such a nice guy. I hope he's doing all right. Um, but yeah, once
Oh,
you
oh yeah. I was like gonna say the one I went to, and you didn't really see this one, the one in Vegas. And I'm totally understand why, because it's Vegas, it's crazy, it's a weekend. But the one I went to in Denver, it was at a Grand Hyatt downtown Denver. And later that evening, I decided, well, I'm going to go down to the lobby bar and have a drink. Little do I know, didn't realize it at first. I looked to the left of me, and there's William Forsythe sitting right next to me, and then a couple right on his other side is I always forget his name, but he played the Wishmaster. He was there along with Bill
yes.
Moseley and Tyler Maine. So imagine sitting up there and having drinks with that group of people.
Yeah, yeah, and that's what's cool about the cons is because, like you just mentioned, depending on the city, there's always sort of a different vibe, there's a different
Hmm.
energy, so, hey, I say go to as many as you can.
Yeah, yeah. I wish I could go to every single one of them, but you know, you can do what you can do, what your finances allow you to. I'm just like excited to see which one I'll go to next year. If just as a fan, and which ones I'll try and go to as a vendor. Um,
Exactly.
oh yeah. So, do you have like an absolute? We talked about your absolute favorite books. How about your absolute go-to movies that you're like, I've got a is one, one of your favorites. If someone asks you what's the first few movies you would recommend, which movies would those be?
Oh my gosh, it depends on I'm bad about this with music
Hmm.
too, because I know a
Hmm.
lot of people just have one artist, one song. Uh, with movies, it kinda does depend on the subgenre, right,
Hmm.
of horror,
Right.
whether it's a slasher, whether it's a mystery, where there's more drama. It just
Hmm.
depends. Uh, and so I don't wanna leave anything or anyone out. I'm sure I'll watch this
Right.
after and be like, "Dang it." Um, I would say some top would be House of Wax, the Vincent Price version.
Oh,
Um,
me not the
I love
Paris Hilton version.
I love that one too. I know opinions are mixed, but it was creative. It was so creative, especially for kind of a remake, mostly in name, right?
Yeah.
Modernized. But yeah, that's definitely one. I've got to say that pretty much anything William Castle. I love all of his movies. Like House on Haunted Hill,
Hmm.
Straight Jacket with Joan Crawford is another one. If people out there haven't seen it, track it down because she is just insane. It's wonderful. Um, and especially, I mean, I know since you started reading the stories in Frightful Fables, you can probably see some patterns. I do enjoy sort of campy, sometimes a little over the top,
Uh-huh.
uh, axes and hatchets. Give all that to me.
Right.
But yeah, I would say those are a few. I mean, I'm all over the place, like I said. In terms of slashers, you know, Terror Train is always going to be at the
Okay.
top of my list. I love a good 80s Canadian
Mm.
slasher. Um, I'm kind of hopping all over the place right now, but those are a few that really stick with me. I like the extremes of, the 80s slashers that are over the top and exaggerated.
Hmm.
But I also enjoy really subtle, understated horror too, which is kind of funny. I guess that's why I'm all over the place and kind of jumping around.
Well, horrors really is kind of like a big, giant Vegas style buffet in
Yes.
that you can find whatever you're in the mood for, you can find it. There's so many different subgenres, and I'm the same way. I like one night I might watch where I might watch Ty West House of the Devil, and then the very next night I'm watching I don't know Fulci's The Beyond or something like that,
Yeah, it's all about
or I'm watching
variety.
Hatchet too. You know, it's like just depends on what I'm in the mood
Mhm.
for.
Yeah, definitely. I can
I know,
relate.
like last night I watched Halloween 4. I had an itching to watch that for some reason. And then after that, I've switched over and decided I was going to watch, well, that was a 1988 movie or some other good movies. Oh, let me watch Friday the 13th, Chapter 7. Then let's watch Hellbound Hellraiser 2. And then let's
Oh
finish
my
off with
gosh.
Maniac Cop. So,
Yeah,
which I
it's
had never
funny.
seen before. I had not seen Maniac Cop before, which I'm surprised I hadn't. But that's the thing with horror.
Yep.
There's so many movies out there. There's still plenty I have not seen that a lot of people have.
And it's funny. I actually just watched Maniac Cop for the first time as
Hmm.
well, not that long ago. And it's funny. This is just a side note, total anecdote.
Right.
But when you do watch movies from that time period,
Hmm.
uh, it's really just surprising to see how many background characters on 80s sitcoms are also overlapping in horror movies.
Oh yeah. Well, it's like the first
Because
time. Go ahead.
yeah, I was gonna say in Maniac Cop, there is actually a bit character from the Golden Girls who has a crazy, crazy role in Maniac Cop, and it's like, who would have thought? This is insane.
Well, it's like when I watched The Burning. I don't know if you've seen that one. And I'm
Mhm.
watching, and of course, that movie came out in '81, I think. And here I am. I'm seeing Jason Alexander with hair, who we all know as
Yeah,
from Seinfeld. George, I think was his character's name. Here he is in The Burning. I'm like, really? But it's the same thing, Jennifer
yeah,
Aniston got her start in Leprechaun. So,
yeah. And some of them embrace those roles more than
hmm.
others. That's for sure. I know. Thinking of you mentioned my two favorite franchise-based slasher movies, which are
Mm,
Halloween 4 and
mm,
Friday the 13th Part 7.
yeah.
So,
What's
we've got
amazing
similar
too?
taste.
Friday the 13th, Chapter 7 is known, and it's one of my favorite of that series. It's probably, I would say, third or fourth favorite. Now, I realize the ending, and the director's gone on saying that's not the ending he wanted. It doesn't really make any sense and all that. And obviously, the MPA had a field day with it, cutting a lot of the gore. But I'm watching that movie, and I'm seeing all the gore that they cut out. But made that same year was Hellraiser 2, where we have a scene where a guy is cutting on himself because he thinks he's full of maggots. How in the hell did they get away with that? And Friday the
Yeah,
13th, and Kane Hodder wasn't allowed to hit that girl the sleeping bag 3 or 4 more times, other than the one time that we see on film.
that's what I think with some of the documentaries and things that are out there, you definitely get the vibe that somebody behind Friday the 13th definitely had made enemies with the MPAA. And I mean, I know
They were being
pretty
singled
much.
out. I agree. I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah, but I mean, even now we see with the Friday the 13th franchise being tied up for so long, it doesn't surprise me that enemies were made because I mean,
Mm-hmm.
even the teams behind the movies can't seem to get along. So
Well,
I
yeah,
I guess.
mainly Cunningham and Victor Miller, and it's a kind of a shame. But you know what? I've said this. I did like the remake. I think it's
Mhm.
if that's the last Friday the 13th movie ever made, great. They ended on a good note and we can move on to something else. If they're going to make another movie, I worry about it not being very good. Let's put it that way.
Yes.
Just seeing the recent trend of reboots, remakes, endless sequels, not quite living up to what they used to be. I would just assume they let it die than let it die an easy death rather than an agonizing death. Let's
Yeah.
focus on what the next Terrifier movie, or if they do another Thanksgiving movie, and let's look forward to the next Ty West movie and so forth.
I agree. Ty West, I mean, I can't wait for Maxine to come
Mm-hmm.
out. And I would rather see some of those movies as opposed to, for example, more Halloween sequels.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I am a major, major, major Halloween franchise fan, and I've never understood so many people talk about all the different timelines,
Mm-hmm.
but I mean, I don't know. I can suspend my disbelief long enough to make the first one through Resurrection kind of, you know, mesh. I
I
mean,
I just go ahead.
no, I mean, if we can accept Jason's age jumping around
Mm-hmm.
or Texas Chainsaw rebooting every single movie, then I can make it all canon. I don't know. Maybe that's just me.
Well, it's like I have my preferred timelines. Like my preferred Halloween timeline is actually 1, 2, and 4. Because
Mhm.
I think that
Same.
right there, the way 4 ends ties in perfectly with the way that the first one started.
Yeah,
With
I agree.
and that's a good one. I like the 1, 2 H2O timeline. That's if I want a happy ending, and
Yeah.
I ignore that resurrection even exists. I just say, nope,
Yeah.
she cut his head off. That's it. End of that timeline. That's it. And then the zombie movies are in their own little universe, and I like those too. Um, But you know what they should do if they're going to do another Halloween movie? See if you can buy the rights, uh, or maybe not. I would say, can we borrow Doctor Strange and have a Halloween multiverse of madness, and just like have a
Huh.
thing where we have 4 or 5 Michael Myers running around at the same time,
You
killing
know,
people with
I
two or
what
three
I
different versions of Laurie Strode, and all that.
I love reading about forgotten or scrapped sequel ideas, and it
Hmm.
seems like there was something along those lines about Michael being able to not teleport necessarily, but
Right.
that they really embrace the I guess paranormal or parallel
Hmm.
universe side of the supernatural. And so stranger things have happened. If you can send Jason to space, why not?
Hey, they even sent Pinhead to space too, so yeah, anything
Oh
can
yeah.
happen.
Mhm.
Which actually, I like that movie. It's unfair because it's only spends maybe 1/3 of that movie's in space. It's does like time jumps kind of throughout that movie, but
Well, the
oh well.
leprechaun went to
They went
space,
to
right?
space too. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, why not? It's the only thing that's left at this point. Let's be real.
Yeah, yeah. I wonder if they'll ever do anything more with, Nightmare on Elm Street ended on such a bad note with that remake. And I really haven't heard much about whether they're going to do anything else with that movie. And I'm not sure if there's anything more they can do with that franchise,
No.
really.
I there are several YouTubers I follow and I like to hear their
Hmm.
ideas. One I think it may have been either Critical Overlord or 3C Film, but they were talking about where the franchise could go and I guess industry rumors that had been
Hmm.
tossed around or spec scripts. And I know they had talked about finding a way, like in Nightmare 2, where Freddy's spirit inhabits a new body, or
Right.
I could, I think that would be the only way to go. Just because even like with Beetlejuice, people are already complaining about, well, Michael Keaton aged, and how does a that kind of entity age? And it's like there's always going to be a complaint,
Yeah.
always, always.
Oh yeah, and I'm willing to give it a try. I mean, I will say I'm glad that my favorite series, Hellraiser, rebounded the way it did with the last one that they had made, the reboot.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm like, well, if that's the last one they ever make, great, because it finally ended on a
Uh
good
huh.
note. My only regret is I wish Doug Bradley could have been. I wish he could have like been in one last good Hellraiser movie as Pinhead, because that was a character they just totally wasted after the fourth film. I think he gets his two
Yeah.
minutes
It's
of
that's got to
cameo at
be
the
tough.
end, and not a good way to treat that actor or the character. I'm glad they at least came back, and I like Jamie Clayton's performance in that. And I guess they're going to make a sequel. I just hope they don't go too far. Like, all right, if you want to make a sequel, fine. Just you know, don't
Right.
don't make it as a cash grab. In other words, and I don't. With Barker having the rights to it now, I don't think that'll be the case.
I agree. And it's funny because Hellraiser and Texas Chainsaw, those are two franchises that we all have our franchises we're more attached to
Mm-hmm.
than others. And
Right.
so Texas Chainsaw is another one where I haven't always been the most plugged in.
Mm-hmm.
And they're it's not like, oh, I'm gonna put on Texas Chainsaw A New Beginning. I just love that movie, or but some
Right.
people do. Um so for me, I think it's been easier to have fun with some of the newer sequels that people haven't really been crazy about. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna give a hot take. Texas Chainsaw 3D is fun. I don't care what anybody says.
there was that period of time where I'm like muddied on which one was which. To be
Yeah.
honest, which one was that? That wasn't the one with Matthew McConaughey in it, was it?
No, so this one was the one where uh, basically this girl inherits the house in Texas, and
Okay.
Leatherface is essentially locked in the basement, and she's supposed to be his caretaker, and obviously he gets loose.
Right.
Um, but it's one of those that people are like, the continuity or this or that.
Mm-hmm.
What continuity have we ever really had with Texas Chainsaw? I had fun with it.
Yeah. Well, I have fun with Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, which a lot of people don't
Exactly.
like, but it is
Right.
what it is. Obviously, it's obviously when you watch like Rob Zombie's House of a Thousand Corpses, you can tell he was directly influenced by that movie when he made that.
Yeah.
And then on the flip side, when he made Devil's Reject, that seemed to feel more like the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre in its tone, not the story, but
Mhm.
in that type of tone of the movie. Yeah, I agree. And I actually like the newest Texas Chainsaw Massacre just because I like the
Yeah.
fact I loved the bus scene. I thought that was the most brilliant scene ever
I
because
did too.
those are the
I
type of
thought this
people
is
you wanted to
the.
see get killed
Yeah,
anyway.
exactly. I feel like they really embraced that Leatherface image, like from the second
Hmm.
one.
Yeah.
Peeling faces off, all of that over the top. So I'm with you. I know not everybody. Some people might watch this and be like, "Oh no, I can't agree with that," and turn this off. Who knows? But I agree with you. I had fun with it. I had a good time.
Oh yeah, and there's some. And one thing I'll say, one series I think that's kind of batting 1,000 almost in that I don't think it's ever made a bad movie is the Evil Dead series. Now, grant they've only made 5 movies that I'm aware of, not, and I'm not counting the TV shows. And I'm thinking, that might be the way to go. Less is more. Just make a few handful of movies and just make them all good. Because I
Well,
like the last one. The last one surprisingly was a lot better than I thought was going to be. Evil Dead Rise.
that's kind of how I feel with the Chucky franchise too, because as wacky and as out there as it has gotten at points, I
Mm-hmm.
have to give especially Don Mancini credit for always managing to tie things together. He's
Mm-hmm.
never never given the go ahead. I know there was the remake reboot, which
Hmm.
they should have just called it a different doll and given a different haircut, and I think it would have been its own thing.
Could have
Um,
called it Larry and say it's Chucky's brother.
Exactly, for a new generation, but I think he's done a really good job of staying the course, explaining away some of the more ridiculous elements that fans didn't so much care for, and every now and then bringing it back to the dark, scary
Hmm.
Chucky we know and love. Even with the TV show, they
Hmm.
at least will have kills and scenes that really give you a chill. It's
Right.
not all just, over the top.
Yeah, excellent too. Um, and I was never a big Chucky fan, but hey, it's got its fans, and it did something right. So I'm just glad the fans hopefully continue to make good movies for the fans of that series as well. Which
Yep.
I know is for some fans it's up and down with that, but hey, it's there. What's a one last thing? Is there any movies you could think of you're you scratch your head and wonder why it didn't get a sequel? It was just a random thought in my head.
Ooh, that is a really
Mm.
good question. Um, let me do you have one in mind while I'm thinking about
Let me
this?
go. I have a
Okay.
couple actually. One, and this is a very little known movie, and it should have become a franchise. There was a movie
Uh-huh.
that came out in 2017 called Siren. Now, if you had seen VHS, the very first segment of VHS, which
Mhm.
had the, I don't know what you want to call this creature, it was kind of a succubus, I think. They took that concept with the same actress that played that, Hannah Fierman, and made a movie off of that character. Now, it's a low budget indie movie, but it was really good. I'm thinking, that's something we haven't had. We've not had really a franchise with a female antagonist or a female demon, really, none that I can think of. I mean, there's been those, but Mrs. Voorhees lost her head at the end of the first one, so they didn't bring her back. Um, so I'm thinking, wow, what a missed opportunity. They could have really done something with that. So that's one movie that comes to mind. And another obvious one is The Burning. The fact that that
Yeah.
movie never got a sequel. Same thing with, yeah, those are two. So any that you can think of now?
Well, yes. Okay, now you got my brain going. I think
Mm,
there are a lot of one-off slashers that some of them it makes sense, like a
mhm,
prom night, that was an ending. A Terror Train, which actually I think there was a reboot and a sequel that came out on Tubi. Have not seen them yet, but I actually heard some pretty good things, so we'll see. Got it on the
right.
watch list. But I think there are you're gonna laugh because going back to this House of Wax,
Mhm,
the one with Paris Hilton, they did leave it kinda open, and that was one that I did always think this I could have seen more because it was a
mhm,
family behind the building, right, behind the
right.
business. Um, so I would have personally loved to see them and take it, run with it. There's also I've heard talk about how cool it would have been to have some kind of sequel or a series based on 13 Ghosts, and I can agree
Mhm,
with that.
right.
Um, Even My Bloody Valentine, the newer one, I think there were a lot of in that remake boom in the
Uh-huh.
early 2000s, mid
2000s, yeah.
2000s. I think there
Mhm,
were a lot of missed opportunities where they really could have rebooted and then kept that character going. Because My Bloody Valentine, I think the look, the leaving things kind of open, um, somebody else maybe coming crawling out of the mine for vengeance. I don't know, but those are
yeah, because
several
the
that I do think.
original one never got a
Yeah,
sequel either, and that was one I was
yeah,
gonna bring up earlier, but I thought, that might be one you might say, and you at least mentioned the reboot,
yeah.
which was pretty good, I thought, for a
Uh-huh.
remake. Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
so I think that was definitely an era where there were some missed opportunities. I think maybe could have struck while the iron was hot, but now I don't know. It's kind of like with the Friday the 13th series. It's been
Mhm.
15 years. Uh, will we get something else? I don't know.
and they're talking about, they talked about doing, we're going to do a series, Crystal Lake series
Mhm.
about Pamela Voorhees, and I'm thinking to myself, is there really enough stuff you can come up that's going to keep the fans interested enough to watch an entire season of Pamela Voorhees? I'm just wondering because ultimately the fans are going to want Jason in the hockey
Right.
mask, and I don't know
Right.
if that's something that would have worked. You could do, I don't know. It didn't seem like that's a concept that could really work for the long term.
I kind of agree because I could see on the one hand if it was maybe like an 8 episode thing and
Hmm.
it's the camp back in the day, uh,
Right.
like leading up to Jason's death. Okay, maybe I could tune in for 8 episodes, but I am also I mentioned Robert Block a couple of times
Hmm.
earlier. I also, Psycho is iconic, classic, and I feel like I was the only person who did not really care for Bates Motel.
I hadn't seen it. I mean, I'm bad about watching television series just because
Yeah,
I just don't have with a movie I can watch 90 to 2 hours and then I'm done, move on to the next.
right.
With TV series anymore, I didn't used to be that way, but over the last few years, I just have a hard time getting into them, have the attention span to tune into them.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I love the sequels to Psycho. Psycho
Hmm.
2, I think, is an amazing I mean, it's probably the first example I can think of a legacy sequel, honestly, because they picked
Yeah.
up 20 years later, same
Hmm.
characters, um, and I just think I felt like we already fleshed this out, we already
Hmm.
got this info, and in the series, I tuned in for a little while, but I'm like, I just don't think, I just don't think our main character would have an iPhone. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that
I
does
just
seem a
don't.
little bit weird. Did they, with that, did they like try to modernize it and have it set in modern times? Is that what they
Yep.
were doing with that? Okay,
They did, and but even then,
maybe.
I'm like, we've got a loner on our hands who doesn't fit in. I mean, this is kind of why is the way he is, or
Hmm.
I guess chicken
Yeah,
and
he
egg
probably
situation,
wouldn't.
whatever. But
Yeah, he might
yeah, he's
still have a
texting friends,
landline.
right? So yeah, I couldn't imagine Mr. Bates going to raves and texting his new friend, and I'm just like, no, this wasn't my perception of this character, right?
No. Yeah, yeah, that would have been weird, but okay.
Anyway.
Well, anyhow, well, once again, thanks for coming on the show, DC. And so where can they find where can people find Frightful Fables at?
You can find the book itself on Amazon. It's also available in ebook format. You can find me across social media at Frightful Fables, and I do have a few conventions coming up and that sort of thing. I actually had a list over here. Nashville Horror Con coming up in July. Got a couple of Georgia-based cons coming up. So if you follow on social media,
Hmm.
I'll also be at one of those with another local author who is wonderful, William Sterling. And his books are messed up if you want to go
Okay.
check him out. Uh, and then also got one in September. I'll be at Fright Reads in Maryland.
Okay.
So that'll be probably my last hurrah for the year while I work on.
Excellent. Well, very good. Well, I'll put those links in the show notes here. And thanks once again for coming on. And thank you, everyone, for watching. And make sure to go out and buy Frightful Fables. And we will see everyone next time.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.